Today we are interviewing Stephen G. Margeton, who is the director of the Judge Catherine J. Dufour Law Library and professor of law at the Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law. Steve, as he prefers to be called, formerly served as librarian of the United States Supreme Court, librarian of the Washington, D.C. law firm of Steptoe and Johnson, and even briefly helped us out as a part-time evening reference librarian when I was still director at American University's Law Library. Steve, let's begin with a little personal history. Can you tell us about where you were raised and about your life both when you were young and today?
Sure, Pat. I'm actually a New Jersey boy. I grew up in a small town in northern Jersey, about 20 miles outside of New York, called Kenilworth. I was educated at a Catholic grammar school in our hometown, and I went several towns away to go to a Catholic high school. So that was sort of my upbringing for the early years. I followed upon high school going to Mount St. Mary's College in Emmitsburg, Maryland. And I was one of the few students in my high school class that actually went south to go to school. Most went either to Pennsylvania, New York, or the New England states. I found that the education that I received was very good, and I think that going to Mount St. Mary's was good for me because it was a smaller college, similar to the high school I went to. And when I was in high school, for sport, I played track for 4 years. And when I went on to the college, they also asked me if I would be willing to run on their track team. So I spent 2 years on the track team while I was there. One of the interesting side issues regarding the track was that we traveled a lot up and down the eastern seaboard during those 2 years that I was on the team, and frequently got to Washington, D.C., which was only about an hour away from us. And I sort of became quite entranced with being in the D.C. area, and I sort of fell in love with it. And that led me to want to stay in the area when I was graduating from college, and I decided to attend George Washington University Law School. And that's what actually got me into the Washington, D.C. area.
So you went to law school at GW, and then library school. You want to tell us a little bit about that experience?
Okay. I went to GW for law school, and after my first full year, I decided that I needed to work part-time, and I just found through one of my roommates that the Library of Congress was hiring students in full and part-time jobs. And so I applied, and I worked there full-time for the summer, and I worked there part-time through my second and third year of law school. When I finished law school, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, I decided that if I wanted to make a real career out of being a librarian, I would need to go to a library science school. And fortunately, Catholic University had a wonderful school at the time, and I was accepted there, and I went to Catholic for 2 years after I graduated from law school.
That's good. It's an excellent library school, always has been. And I have a son, in fact, who went through it. He was working at the University Mullen Library on the campus at the time and got tuition remission, which was wonderful.
Always helps.
Might have had to help pay for it if he hadn't.
A number of my staff now take advantage of the tuition remission, and that's a nice benny that Georgetown can't offer, or GW can't offer, or even AU.
That's right.
But we can, and that's a great benefit.
They can offer them perhaps in other disciplines, but not that one, since they don't happen to have the right kind of school.
That's correct.
Yeah. Let's move on a little bit now into your career in law librarianship. Most of us in the field have sort of focused on one particular type of library or another, academic, firm, private court libraries. you've sort of done all of them, and that sort of makes you not probably unique, but certainly not somebody with, there are not a lot of us that have that experience. Could you talk a little bit about that, but perhaps as you do also, you mentioned you were working as a, I guess, student assistant of some sort at the Library of Congress, but when you decided to become a law librarian, as opposed to perhaps some other type of librarian, did any process or any particular individual or individuals play any role in that decision?
That's a good question. Unlike many others, my career in law librarianship was not by design. I sort of fell into it, as I mentioned a few moments ago. In the summer after my first year in law school, I went to work at the Library of Congress full-time for the summer in their interlibrary loan department. And being quite a novice, I wasn't even sure when I took the position what that meant, but it was an excellent introduction to the Library of Congress. At that point in time, the loan division had teams who worked retrieving material for administrative agencies, for Congress itself, and for academic institutions, primarily because we were the library of last resort. And what it did permit me to see is how a very large, a very well-run library operates. And I thought that was just invaluable to educating me in this particular career. Typically, as a beginning a student in the library at that point, you would be assigned to a team and they would rotate through one of those three sections. Administrative agencies usually have very, very difficult requests, and a large number of those were sent over to two staff persons at the loan division who are well versed in working with the agencies. We primarily focused on academic and Congress, and each day, typically each day, when you went in, you would be given about 80 requests to retrieve. Some were very easy and some were terribly difficult. But what it did was it forced you to use the library's card catalog to find the material and then to actually go out into the decks or stacks, as they're known, to find the material personally and retrieve it. Because you had 80 requests a day, some of those had to go automatically through a pneumatic tube system to other decks to be found for you. So it was both you going out and retrieving and having some of the deck attendants retrieve material for you. We also had some difficult materials that were really very hard to work with, and they were typically materials in Russian or Eastern European languages. And we had a separate division of the Library of Congress called the Cyrillic Law Division. And we would usually save up those requests and go over there one day a week and try to retrieve those materials. The language was, the alphabet was a little bit different, so we had actually cards that told us letter for letter what the Cyrillic alphabet said and what the American or the Anglo alphabet said. And again, we would wait for the end of the week and then we'd go over and do all those. The Congressional Research was quite interesting because there the request from Congress came in by telephone. And it really taught you a lot about being able to use a telephone system. We would be assigned to the congressional desk for about 3 weeks. There were usually two of us handling the phone. And in addition to answering the phone and taking down the requests, we used to have little shoe boxes with 3x5 cards in them. And we would have to, while they're talking to us on the phone, we would have to find the right committee of Congress and see, and subcommittee, and see if that individual calling was actually allowed to borrow material. So you're doing things with your finger while you've got your phone on your shoulder, but it did teach you how to work, with Congress, with the requests and the like. And with those requests, we would pass them off to other loan division staff who would actually go to the shelves to find the material. And very typically the material was not a title, it was a subject request. So the Congress would, staffers would be asking you to go into the library and find the best material that you could that would fill that request. Mm-hmm. So they were very immediate, very demanding, but it taught you a lot on how to find things by subject matter and also how to work the phone. So that was very, I think it was an excellent experience for me. But towards the end of the summer, I had an opportunity to move upstairs into the American-British Law Division of the Law Library of Congress, part-time, because they were looking for someone to work with their records and briefs collection. Now this job that I had for a couple of months was quite deadly. You were basically charged with collecting all the records and briefs from the circuit courts in the United States, the federal circuit courts, and collecting them and getting them ready for binding. And you were working in a little tiny office, no windows, no light, just pulling these things together. I, by that time, was sort of getting interested in what a law library does. And I used to spend my lunch hours walking around the stacks of the Law Library of Congress, trying to find out what all the materials were about and how they all fit together. The law librarian at that point was Lewis Coffin, and he asked at one point, was I interested enough to perhaps want to work out in the reference area? And unfortunately, I didn't have any serious reference training, but I said sure, I would be happy to move out there. So for my second and third year of law school, I worked out in the reading room of the American-British Law Division, and I learned my legal bibliography on the spot. And I also learned how to handle requests from individuals walking up to the desk when, unlike Congress, you couldn't put them on hold while you checked for things. You had to handle it right then and there. So it was good training. And the other really interesting thing I think about working at the Library of Congress was I had an opportunity to work with the other foreign law divisions. We had, in addition to American and British, which was one division, which included all the islands, we also had the Hispanic Law Division, we had the European Law Division, we had the Near East African Law Division, and the Foreign Law Division. The Far Eastern Law Division. And they all had very, very excellent librarians. They were quite small at the time, but they were charged with the responsibility of handling all the foreign law research for Congress. The American-British Law Division only handled really the British law side. The American law side was handled by the Legislative Reference Service, which would soon become the Congressional Research Division of the Library of Congress. So it was really a wonderful opportunity, again, to see a large library in operation and how they operate, how they divide things into manageable units, and how everyone worked together in that process. So I was very pleased with that. However, when I graduated from law school, there were not a whole lot of opportunities available at Library of Congress, but they did have an opening for a full-time reference librarian in the American-British Law section, and I applied for it, and because of my background and that I had worked there before, I was able to get that job. And I was very pleased to work there for 2 years as one of the 4 reference librarians in the reading room. And it really taught you quite a bit about learning to work with individuals, both pro se patrons who walk in off the street and have problems, and also for professional lawyers who use the Library of Congress as their particular library because there weren't that many opportunities to find places in DC at that time. The reason why I moved on was because there weren't a whole lot of opportunities to go up the ladder at the Library of Congress at that time. I had the good fortune of having a chief of the American British Division for 2 years while I was there, Marlene McGurl. She was very interested in seeing how, how I might develop, where I might go. There was some discussion about whether I might be staying there, but in the end, I had an opportunity from a law firm in Washington, D.C., Steptoe & Johnson, which was a firm of about 50 attorneys at that point, to move over to their firm and to become the first law-trained librarian. And actually this came about through a connection with American University. The director at that time was interested in helping out Steptoe and actually called me to see if I would be interested in applying for the position. So I did, and I was fortunate to get it. And I moved from the Library of Congress in 1972 to the law firm. There was some talk about, whether that was a wise move, whether the law firm would as soon as they needed to save money, might disband the law library. But I was there 13 years, so that really didn't happen. I started there with a staff of 1.5, one full-time, one part-time person. And by the time I left in 1985, we had 15 on the staff. The firm had actually grown from 50 to about 200. And I also had a wonderful opportunity to design and build 2 major libraries for the firm in 2 different buildings, and also 2 smaller libraries for the firm in satellite offices that we had within the block that the firm was on. It was a great time to move to private law firms because a lot of the firms were just beginning to decide that they wanted to have law-trained librarians. A number of the firms decided that they wanted to have really impressive-looking libraries to impress the clients. Money wasn't a big issue back in the late 70s and early 80s. So we were encouraged to develop and provide excellent library services and to build libraries that were going to project the image of the law firm. At that point in time, Covington and Burling was the primary large law firm in town, and everybody was sort of trying to imitate some of the design aspects of their library and provide services similar to their library. It was a great time. You're working with real attorneys, you're working with real clients. We built the library up quite extensively, and at that point in time, computers were just becoming into vogue and computer databases were just being established, and we did quite a bit with our own, not only the clients, but also with our own attorneys, helping them learn how to use these databases effectively. I could point to one major one was that in about 1975-76, Lexis became the first major automated computer service available, and Steptoe was the second firm in town to get it, only beat out by Arnold and Porter by 1 week. And it was something that the tax staff wanted to get for the law firm, and so we were able to get the firm to agree to try it, and it was quite successful, and later on, of course, Westlaw followed quickly thereafter. As I mentioned, I liked working for the firm. However, after about 11 or 12 years, I was getting a little antsy, a little bored, and I needed something a little different, I thought, for my career. At that point in time, just by luck, a friend and director at Mercer Law Library, Leah Chanin, who is also being interviewed for these sessions, asked me if I would be interested in serving on a committee, an ad hoc committee of Congress, because I was in Washington already, dealing with the dissemination of federal documents in electronic format. Now, at that time, I should point out that Leah was president of the American Association of Law Libraries, and it was her responsibility to arrange for someone to work on this ad hoc committee of Congress. It was an interesting committee. I accepted. It was an interesting committee to join. I was representing AALL. We had representatives from special libraries. We had representatives from the American Library Association. We had representatives from the Information Industries Association, from the government the government printing office, and also we were led by a librarian who was quite well known on the Hill, Bernadine Hadesky, who was part of the Joint Committee on Printing Staff. The purpose of this committee, again, was to see what possibilities were available to disseminate federal information in electronic format. The driving force really was finances. It was just costing the government too much money to send paper product out to all the depository libraries. Now, depository libraries, there are several different types. Each state has the opportunity to have 2 full depositories, meaning that they get everything the government prints. And then there were an arrangement for partial depositories, meaning that those libraries could select what they needed or wanted for their patrons. In 1981, the federal government passed legislation that permitted all academic law schools to be partial depositories. So it became very important for the academic law librarians to understand what's available and how we might receive it. And that's how AALL got invited to join this committee. Obviously, in the early 1980s, there wasn't much being done with computers. There were just beginning to be a tool known as a CD-ROM. And we spent 2 days a month for 2 years traveling around the Washington area, looking at all the new technology, looking at how materials were currently being distributed by agencies, learning how GPO, the government printing office, worked. And it was just a very interesting learning opportunity. But what it also introduced me to was, I thought, gee, it would be nice to be on Capitol Hill. And in 1985, a friend of mine, Roger Jacobs, who was director at the U.S. Supreme Court Library, contacted me and said that he would shortly be leaving to go become the director at Notre Dame, and would I be interested in applying for the position at the Supreme Court. Well, with my interest in perhaps moving on from private firm practice, I thought, well, it's a possibility, let me give it a shot. And I did apply and was selected by by Judge Warren Berger to become the librarian of the court in 1985. And I moved there in July of that year to take over Roger's duties as the librarian of the Supreme Court. Wonderful opportunity, great library. It gave me an enormous amount of administrative experience I never would have received working in a law firm, even a large law firm. It had a staff of 24. It had a library collection at that time of probably 300,000 volumes. It had direct access to the Library of Congress to borrow additional materials. It obviously was a very, very important library in the United States. We had a wonderful library reference staff who worked very closely both with chambers and with the law clerks to help them do their legal research, to follow up leads on items that were footnoted in briefs that the court was reading. It was an opportunity for me to take a charge not only of the library but also to participate in the running of the Supreme Court itself. I had what was known as a statutory appointment. That means that it was actually in the United States Code that there will be a librarian of the U.S. Supreme Court. There was also 3 others that were statutorily appointed. One was the recorder of decisions, another was the clerk, and the third was the marshal of the court. So the 4 of us worked very closely together. In addition to these major players, we also had a director of computer services. We had a public affairs director. We had a general counsel for the court. We had an administrative executive for the Chief Justice, who actually was the chair of our committee. And each, once a month, we would get together and we would look at all the things that were coming up at the court, and we would arrange to make what decisions were necessary to make sure that everything went smoothly at the court. And it could be a wide variety of topics, but what we tried to do was relieve the Chief Justice from the individual day-to-day operations of the court, and that worked very well. We were really taught not to talk a whole lot about what we were doing at the court, to keep confidentiality. So when people would ask me, well, how is it to work at the court, I usually sort of confine my remarks to my administrative details and perhaps social activities at the court. But one of the nice benefits of being the library director is that they had a reserved seat for you in the courtroom for every argument. So whenever you wanted to go down and listen to an argument, it was automatically available, for you. Occasionally, you might be bumped out of your seat by more important people on Capitol Hill, but you were always allowed to be in the courtroom and to have a seat somewhere, if not in your own chair. Social activities of the court also were frequent. The officers of the court were invited to most of the formal receptions and the like, and it was an opportunity not only to represent the court, but you had an opportunity to meet a lot of the more important people in the Washington area, and to perhaps talk with them and get a little bit of a connection with people outside the court building as well. I worked at the court for a little over 3 years. My sense was that I really wanted to move into academic library. I thought the court was an excellent preparatory because it was so large. The staff was large. Collection development was large. And also they taught me a lot of how to manage finances for a large library, which was important. I didn't have that experience at the Library of Congress. I didn't have that experience at the law firm for the most part. But at the Supreme Court, I was really taught how to put together a library budget for a larger library, how to present it, and so forth. And it was interesting. One day a year, we would all get together, those of us who were responsible for budgeting for the court, and we would drive across the street, usually with at least 1 or 2 justices, and go to our congressional staff meeting with Congress and present our budget and defend our budget. And it always was an interesting opportunity because Congress rarely saw the justices of the court. So when they came over, they were quite deferential and very pleased to have us. We didn't always get what we wanted, but most of the time, we did. Following up on the court, I applied for a position at Catholic University of America's Law Library, which became open in 1988. It was an opportunity for me to move to academia. As Professor Keogh may have mentioned earlier, I worked briefly at American University while I was at the law firm working night and weekend days. And I also taught legal research at the International School of Law, which became George Mason's law school for a few years. But moving on to Catholic would be a major jump into an academic setting. And one of the enticements for me to apply there was that they wanted to build a new law building. Now, as I mentioned, I had done 2 libraries at the Steptoe and Johnson and 2 satellite libraries. I also had done a bit of construction, very modest, at the Supreme Court. So I thought, well, I really have some background in this. That would be a lot of fun to do that and do it on a grand scale. I was fortunate. I did get the position at Catholic in 1988, and I embarked on a 6-year project to design the law library section of the new building and to work with them to arrange with alumni to get enough funds to build the building and then to go through the actual design and building process, which was started in 1989. The design phase was over by 1990, and then we waited a couple of years before we had to go ahead to actually start construction in 1992, and we opened up the new building in June of 1994. Okay, well, it was an interesting process because it was a tenure track position, which I wanted to be very careful about, and I had to learn to work with 40 new colleagues who were, for the most part, fully tenured faculty members, and I found fairly quickly, though, that Catholic was a wonderful place to work, and not only was I at the law school, but I was at a university that had a library school with it, and they were terrific feeders of students to work in the library, and for our own staff who wanted to get a library degree, they could arrange to do that, getting student remission from the university. So we had in the law library at that time, we had a fine crop of constant new librarians coming with us, or staff who wanted to get their library degree once they began working with us. It took a while to shake down the new building. We were very pleased with the end result. In truth, we still have law school directors and architects coming to look at the building to see what we did right and what we did wrong. But the building has served us very well. We're in our 19th year now in the building. The library itself was designed in a simple shoebox format, but we did make sure that we had enough floor loading or strength in the floors to be able to increase the shelving with compact shelving as we moved along. I've had an opportunity to increase the staff. It was 11 when I came, it's now 20, and we've been able to provide I think excellent research services to the faculty, and they've increased. It's now about 50 full-time faculty members, and we have a very good interlibrary loan service, and our technical services staff has increased somewhat as well. Right now we're all in budget watching scenarios because of the downturn in students coming to law school. So, I mean, you do have sort of an ebb and flow of the finances of law schools, but for the most part I've been very lucky. When I went there, they promised me they would increase funding to build the library up, and they certainly have come through on that. We've been building not only the American law section, but we have a very strong British and Canadian section, and we've been working in the area of foreign law. One area of foreign law that has been quite beneficial to the law library is the fact that in 1999 or 2000, right around that time, the law school, which up to that time had a connection with the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. The law school at that point started an American law program for them, and in 2004 the program tapped the law librarians to see if we would be willing to go over and teach an introductory course in American research. And the program itself sends over about 8 or 9 faculty members during the course of the year to teach different substantive areas, but they actually needed some background in the legal research side, and we were able, through Westlaw, to provide the students that we teach a introductory Westlaw access, and we teach them how to use Westlaw, and then we teach them how American law is arranged, and it's quite different from their civil law concept. Over the last last 8 years, we've been able to send a librarian there to teach in October to kick off the American law program, and of course that's kind of a nice benefit for the librarians to have an opportunity to not only get to Poland and perhaps travel in Europe a bit, but also to work with an entirely different group of law students. In light of that too, I should mention that I also teach an advanced legal research and writing course in the spring, and that has been a lot of fun, and it's taught me a lot about how to relate with our students and teach them some of the wonderful materials that we have in American law. But I should stop there.
Well, sounds like you have a variety of duties in your various jobs, and you probably had a very fascinating career so far. But I also note that you've done a lot outside of the various employing institutions and places. You've been quite active in the associations. You served a year as president of the Law Librarians of Washington, D.C., I remember. But I also have fond memories of a little project you and I both were involved in some years back when the American Association of Law Libraries annual meeting was here in Washington. And in those days, the association didn't yet have a staff at headquarters other than one individual who wasn't able to manage conventions and stuff. So you and I were charged with doing the exhibit hall, working with the various vendors who would be coming in and exhibiting and paying fees for that. And it was quite an undertaking. I remember we were busy as heck getting it all set up and maintaining it, but it worked out beautifully. But I remember one particular interesting thing we decided, because nobody else had decided. We figured out, well, what are we supposed to charge these people for a booth? And nobody knew. In those days, apparently the executive board didn't deal with that, or didn't in this case. So I think you and I looked at what had been charged the previous year, figured out this was a more expensive city than most, added a bit to it, and said that's what we're charging. And we did, and made money for the association. And nobody questioned, as far as I know, how this process occurred.
No, it was an interesting undertaking, and we were lucky enough for it to be the last year that the association did it that way. The next year they hired a professional company. Yeah. But I think it was an interesting prospect or undertaking from the point of view of dealing with all the law library vendors that we've known for years and try to work out their wishes and disagreements about what spot in the exhibit hall where they were going to be located, and and also what we could promise them, what we couldn't promise them, and whether they needed one booth or whether we needed to give them 2 or 3 booths
sell them 2 or 3 booths.
That's true, sell them. And I don't know about you, Pat, but I really stressed out over that.
Well, I think we both did, because we were used to dealing with these folks when they were selling us something. Now it was a reversal, and it is different.
But it all worked out, as you said. It was, and that's the way the association did it for a number of years. Mm-hmm. When a convention came to town, the local people put everything together. I think at that point we only had an association secretary, one person.
Yes,
in Chicago,
Babe
Russo. And so it was really up to the individuals in a locale. But I do recall in those early years, this is when the association was 600 600 or 800 people would come to a meeting, very small. We had some wonderful meetings because the local associations really jumped in and put things together. And those are the days that I really remember in the very beginning. My first meeting was 1972. Actually, I went to the closing banquet in 1970, but the first meeting I went to was 1972. It was in Chicago, and I thought it was amazing what was going on. You know, again, I was working at the Library of Congress at the time, but I really wasn't connected in with law librarians too much. I had just joined the local DC Association, and that was my first meeting. And that really spurred me on to become interested and to start working for them. Within 2, 3, 4 years, I was chair of the American Association of Law Libraries Education Committee. And in the very early years, in terms of training, we used to have rotating institutes. And they were primarily geared to our members who were not librarians. They would rotate, there were 4 of them, and they would rotate. One would be administration, one would be cataloging. I'm not sure what the other... Reference, okay.
And there was a 4th one.
There was a 4th, yeah. And this had been going on for a number of years. I don't recall exactly how many, but I'm sure it must have been at least 10, 15, 20 years. And in 1976, the association was thinking about changing the format for these institutes. Now, typically, they were for maybe 4 or 5 days before the meeting, so it would be like a 4 or 5 day institute, and then you would, the meeting, you would be at the same town where the meeting was going to be held, so you just transfer where you were going each day. But in the middle 70s, it was decided that maybe it was time for us to put together institutes for our membership who had library degrees and who were looking for more elevated education in that area. So the Education Committee was charged with investigating whether we could do institutes that would be different each year and that would be run by volunteer members of the association who had an interest in that field. And we were able to make that change. We had a 1 year where we had to sort of wait to see how the whole thing was going to form together, and fortunately Harvard Law School jumped in and said they would do a history of law institute that year. I think that was 76, I'm not 100% sure. And then the next year we had an international institute in Montreal. And then we were on the road, and every year thereafter, we had an institute on a topic of interest to a number of our librarians who had degrees in law librarianship, and many had law degrees as well. And it wasn't a set topic, it was whatever the topic of choice was, and we were sure that we would have enough interest and enough attendees to make it financially available. So I was the chair of the committee during that switchover phase. The other thing I did, as I mentioned earlier, was to be on this committee on dissemination of information, federal information electronic format. Did a few other things. I was on a preservation committee, and a few other minor committees of the association. And I guess I was president of our local DC Law Librarian Society in 96, 97. And that was an interesting year too, because we normally had an education program in town each fall, but that year we decided to attend an education program in Toronto. So all of us convened up in Toronto for a program that was actually very, very good. And I had an opportunity to work with many of the fine librarians that we have in town. At that point in time, we had about 700 members here in DC. Not all of them were active, but we had a very large contingent of private law firm librarians, academic law librarians, association law librarians, Library of Congress, Supreme Court. So it was quite a large contingent.
Well, I appreciate, Steve Margeton, your talking with us this afternoon and taking time to fill us in on some of the history of some of the rather interesting things that we've all seen over the years. You mentioned how at the time we were sort of nervous about whether some of these new initiatives were going to work out, whether we could afford them. It all did in the long run, in both areas, and both the finances and the success. And a lot of it was due to you and people just like you who got these things organized and up and running. So I appreciate that. Before we close, is there anything in particular you would like to add? You get the last words.
Not really. You know, we're all worried about where librarianship and law librarianship is going.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, obviously we're moving heavily into automation, computer services and the like. I've always been one who said I don't want to lease my library, but unfortunately I think we are moving because law libraries are getting to be extremely expensive, and we're having to both reduce our hard copy content, join the ranks of those leasing libraries through various databases, but also I think we're beginning to work together more with our colleagues in libraries amongst the community to save where we can. And I know that's one area where I'm looking at right now. Our clientele are getting smarter and smarter about how to do legal research, so I think we're going to have to keep on training and have our education, our institutes and so forth to stay ahead of them by a leg or two.
Yeah, a lot of change happening, probably accelerating in terms of more change more rapidly than we even experienced in the last couple of decades or so. It's an exciting time, I imagine, to be a director or in any part of the profession.
It's a great time, and it's a great field. I always say the years go by so fast. Some of those days are pretty tough, but the years always go by very fast. I've never been sorry that I moved in that direction into research rather than being, a litigating attorney or something of that nature.
Well, I share that with you, even though I've been retired for now almost a decade, and I suppose I've forgotten all the difficult things and the bad things of being an active practitioner in the law library field, but it was a wonderful way to earn a living, I thought, too.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Pat.
Thank you, Steve, for being here this afternoon.